Welcome, LA Progressive friends and family. Today, Dick and I are happy again to have Henry Giroux with us. He has so graciously allowed us to publish his work at the LA Progressive. Henry currently holds the McMaster University Chair for Scholarship in the Public Interest in the English and Cultural Studies Department and is the Paulo Freire Distinguished Scholar in Critical Pedagogy. His most recent books include The Terror of the Unforeseen on Critical Pedagogy, second edition, Race, Politics, and Pandemic Pedagogy, Education in a Time of Crisis, Pedagogy of Resistance Against Manufactured Ignorance and Insurrections, and Education in the Age of Counter-Revolutionary Politics, and more. Henry, welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Oh, it's always a pleasure.
And today's Dick's birthday. Happy birthday, honey.
Yeah, so we're Dick and Sharon of LA Progressive, and we're honored to talk about Henry's latest piece that he sent to us, Neoliberalism's Plague, the Erosion of Consciousness in Education, a detailed piece and fascinating that outlines the effect really neoliberalism in particular has had on our education systems over a number of years. Would you like to talk to us about that?
Well, I think that since the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan married Margaret Thatcher, and they both agreed that government should in no way assume any kind of social responsibility for anybody, including the public interest. And Margaret Thatcher went even further and said society doesn't exist. It's just an accumulation of individuals and families. What we have seen is such an erosion of the social. What we have seen is an enormous attack on public goods. And what we have seen is an increasing attack leading up so many years later to Trump, in which one of the few vestiges of the public good that's left actually is the university. And when you operate off the assumption that the only thing that matters are market values and the only relationships that matter are exchange relationships, and the only thing that matters is profit itself, what you get is not simply the foundation for an attack on democracy. You really get the foundation for fascism, because all of a sudden, I mean, we've seen two things that I just want to quickly mention, and that is that neoliberalism since 2008, it's clear the financial crisis has failed. It can't live up to its promises of lifting all boats up, social mobility, somewhat spreading out the wealth. It's nonsense. It's if anything, we have inequality has gotten worse. The class relationships have gotten more poisonous, and the very foundation of democracy as a legacy now is so eroded that people don't even take it seriously anymore because they associate it with the financial elites, and so it's become an empty slogan. But I think that what we need to be very concerned about at this moment in history, given the long legacy of neoliberalism and its attack, is that far from being dead, under Trump, it's on steroids. And we see this particularly with the attack on higher education, which I have never seen anything like this in my entire life. And I had friends who were called up in the 50s during the McCarthy period. Of course, you had the Red Scare in the 20s. You had a previous period. Education has always been under assault. But I don't want to say they've won, but I want to say the scope and intensity and direction and focus of this attack is something that we should not ignore, because education may be one of the few places left where even a glimmer of the ideals and the promises of democracy and what it means to create an informed citizenry, for which a democracy will not exist without, is under siege. And I have my goal at this moment as a writer and a public intellectual is to make education so central to this struggle we're in. Because if we can't raise consciousness, if we can't get to a point where we say there is a red line, and once that red line is crossed, we're not in a democracy at all anymore. But we need to make clear what the red line is, where the distinction, where we have moved from, let's say, equality to corruption, where oligarchs are taking over the country, where, people like Elon Musk are claiming they're going to eliminate Social Security, where some moron who's going to be appointed to head the FBI is saying things like he's going to turn the Hoover building, which probably isn't a bad idea, into a museum. But it goes on and on. And so I'm trying to, in some way, capitalize on a project that I've been writing about for 50 years with Paulo Freire. And I don't think it's any more important than it is right now.
So thank you so much, Henry. Thank you again for giving us this brilliant piece. And one of the challenges for me and one of my objectives in providing the LA Progressive platform is to try to explain things to people, because I have come to believe that people will banter around language that they don't really have a real grasp of what the language means. For example, neoliberalism.
Yeah.
So I often think, and you tell me if I'm wrong, because I think that you're probably much more educated on this topic than I am. But in 1971, Lewis Powell wrote the famous Powell Memo, which kind of lays out a roadmap for neoliberalism to flower in the United States, which doesn't mean that Lewis Powell was the planner of neoliberalism, but the memo itself is a short document. It's like 8 pages, and actually we have it. We're going to put a link to it, to the Powell Memo, but it lays out the domains where the conservative body should attack in order to take control. And there are 6 domains. And of the 6 domains, aside from private ownership of public spaces, of the 6 domains, 4 of them focus on education and communication. Education at the lower levels, at the secondary levels, at the university level, there's I would say a predominant focus on education, so that the far right, this would enable them to take control. So I want to talk about that 1971 and that memo. How does that tie into what you're talking about here?
I think it's a very, very important intervention on your part. And I've written about the Powell Memo, and I actually should republish this piece. Probably not as smart as the way you've articulated it, but the point is that it's a very significant moment in which neoliberalism is no longer seen as simply an economic ideology. It's also seen as an educational ideology. It's not just about economic institutions and the free market and all that nonsense, and deregulation and privatization. It's also about creating an ideology, a form of what I call pedagogical terrorism, that basically seems to suggest that there's a real struggle here over ideas, over the notion of agency, over the notion of what counts as education, over what students should learn, and more importantly, what education should not be a public good, and what students should not learn how to be critical thinkers, and what students, in a sense, should be pushed towards, which is conformity and obedience. And that document basically, and it to me was just so startling, because what Powell recognized was that neoliberalism simply as an economic system and pushed in that direction would fail. It had to be able to legitimate itself. And in order to legitimate itself, it had to basically produce a pedagogy. It had to produce a set of educational assumptions that would basically be the ideas that could be used to both reshape education and attack education as a public good. Now, there are 2 things about that we need to be supplemented. 2 things that need to supplement that analysis. And that one is you have the rise of people like Hayek, and of course in the United States, none other than Milton Friedman. And I think that if you go back and you read the 1970 article he wrote, really in conjunction with the Powell Memo in the New York Times, which is shocking, because he says he doesn't refer to the Powell Memo, but he says, hey, look, he says, we need to get rid of this question of social responsibility. He said, business has no sense. It's corrosive. He says, social responsibility is corrosive. What it's about profits. It's about investors. That's what it's about. Get rid of it. We don't need to talk about social responsibility. So in a sense, what he was really doing was reinforcing the Powell Memo by giving it an even sharper kind of edge which basically said economic activity of all sorts, corporate activity, institutional activity, should be entirely divorced. Are you ready? From social cost. That's a prescription for fascism because it turns people into monsters, because it says that ethics doesn't matter, social responsibility is a liability, and if you believe in that, you're weak. Fast forward 50 years, and what do you have? You have J.D. Vance saying that the professors are the enemy. You have people saying we have to deal with the real enemy, which is the enemy within. And who is that? That's the critical oppositional press. That's people like you and me. Institutions that basically support some notion of holding power accountable, they need to be destroyed. This is all part of that neoliberal legacy. I mean, it's all.
Can I just go back to the social?
Yeah, sure.
I want to expand upon that social cost. When I heard the term social cost, I thought of a couple of examples. For example, like the privatization of prisons,
yes,
where there's no concern really about what's happening to the prisoners. The number one objective is the bottom line. But then you have people that become so wealthy that they can help to shape and alter laws so that the prisons are almost guaranteed to be full. The social cost falls on our shoulders.
No. I mean, I'm thinking of the health insurance industry in light of this recent assassination in New York City. God forbid, nobody wants to justify that. But at the same time, these insurance companies are worthless.
Yes.
I mean, basically, do they expedite care? No. Do they decrease cost? No. Do they provide services that people don't have in order to get the benefits they need? No, they're useless. It's all based on profit. They shouldn't exist. I mean, when it comes to healthcare, they're a living example of how parasitic this neoliberal logic actually is. I mean, we need a new language for this. We need to really understand how an economic system, it's not just an economic system, how it becomes predatory. How it capitalizes on people's suffering, how it ignores any viable sense of social responsibility, how it refuses to give support for people who have brain cancer because it finds that 40 years ago they smoked a cigarette. I mean, there's ways in which they can do anything they can to deny, divert what was written on the bullet casings of this guy's bullet. It's really kind of interesting that the American public has no sense of what the social means, both in terms of benefiting them around education, around healthcare, around housing, around inequality, around the planet, and no understanding that they're basically electing people who, and we need to resurrect this term, who are basically the elite of the ruling class. Neoliberalism is about the ruling class. It concentrates wealth and power in the hands of relatively few people. That's what it does. And it makes everybody else and the institutions that might support them, it either eliminates them or it does everything it can to make them powerless. It's I'll tell you, the divine right of kings was terrible. But neoliberalism is worse.
It's the divine right of capital.
It's the divine right of capital.
So, Henry, you say you've been talking about these issues, writing about these issues for half a century, about how these neoliberal tendencies have undercut democracy, have changed education from the goal to produce well-informed citizens into perform and producing robotic workers. Where do you think this leads, and what do you think where further? And now we're in the Trump years again. He's already taken charge, and those trends are going to accelerate. So where is this going to leave us in the near future? And is there anything people can do about it?
Oh, I mean, look, we're not just simply in a crisis. We're in the midst of what might be a planet-ending catastrophe. I mean, Fred Jameson, before he died, had that famous quip. He said, "I can imagine the end of the world before I can imagine the end of capitalism," right? And I think that the contradictions now in the next 2 years are going to become so severe. There's a potential for people losing Social Security.
Mhm.
People are going to be deported in trains and buses reminiscent of the trains and the buses that took people to concentration camps in the 1930s. The inequality in wealth and power will just skyrocket. And I guess that what I'm saying is that if there was ever a time for the question of education and language to really highlight these crises at a local, national, and state and national level, it's time. That's the first thing. Every one of these policies that will be passed, every one of these injustices has to be made so visible that it would be difficult within the existing normative language we use in the legacy press not to recognize what's going on. In other words, this kind of fascist politics, economics, and pedagogy has really got to be exposed. There's no sitting back anymore. The politics of normalization has got to be completely eliminated. We can't stand for this anymore. The racism will get worse. We know how this is going to turn out. Secondly, you've got to have mass movements. We cannot allow these movements to fragment into local forms of opposition. I mean, local forms of opposition matter because that's where people live. But there has to be national organizations that hook up with social movements and unions that have the power to shut down this economy. Chris Hedges has argued, my friend Chris Hedges has argued recently, and I agree with him. We need to reinvent the category of coupling mass consciousness with direct action. So when we hear about 400 faculty who are being laid off at a university in Texas because they refuse to make the claim that abortion is not a sin, it's not a matter of mobilizing just that faculty. It's a matter of faculties all over the country stepping up with some courage and saying, look, we need a national strike, 2 days, just to give people a sense of the power they have in terms of what they can do. The power doesn't lie simply with repression. It also lies with direct action, with organizing. We need teach-ins. We need teachers all over the country at the public school level, in higher education, to start talking to students and also learning from them. The campus protest over the Palestinian issue has been such a mark of courage on the part of a generation that is being forced out of jobs, being poisonously humiliated, talked about as being anti-Semitic. All the while, I was reading this morning, and I wrote about this kid in Gaza who was burned alive. And the video shows this kid reaching up with, IVs in his hands. And if this can't mobilize people, I mean, this is the end point of capitalism. This is the end point. And we now have a government that represents a justification and an argument for that end point with no apologies.
Absolutely.
No apologies. None.
So I've had this burning question about, are we human beings hard-coded to continue to create these kinds of systems that enable exploitation? When I think of direct action, if you can envision someone kicking over an anthill and saying, okay, that's done. And of course, you come back the next day and there's just a new anthill. And it seems like if you look at the past 500, 600, 700 years, our civilizations, the way that they've been structured is we have a small group at the top that benefits from the labor of the entire bottom. So, it's like a pyramid structure, whether you're talking about feudalism or slavery or capitalism. You have those at the top, like Elon Musk, who the hell elected him? And now he's making all kinds of decisions. But we have been groomed, either one of two things. We've either been groomed to accept this and see this as normal, or we're hard coded to see this as normal. I don't know which. What do you think, Henry?
I don't believe in the hardwired theory. The hardwired theory takes away people's agency, and it sort of relegates it to a kind of universal notion of DNA. I mean, people are shaped. They're shaped within the cultures in which they find themselves, and they're shaped by forces often far more powerful, whether they be repressive or whether they be ideological. And I mean, human existence is a struggle. It's a struggle over both humanity and a struggle to survive. And it seems to me increasingly we have tended to move away from the use of repression to put into place systems of power. Then we have an ability to convince people that they should internalize forms of oppression and live by it. Now, the side of this that I think we need to recognize is, look, you don't ever want to fall into the category of believing that power is only about domination. Because once you do that, there's a tendency to not only be seduced by power, but to become complicitous with it, because you lose all hope.
Love it. Go ahead. Preach.
Without any hope, there's no agency. Without any agency, there's no hope. And it seems to me there's always the glimmer, the glimmer of resistance, always. And I think if we really want to say is something hardwired, not to reverse myself, but I think that people are always capable of struggling, even in the worst conditions, for a better sense of what it means to be human, for humanity, for justice. And I think that what we increasingly have to face is that it's a struggle. It's not given. Where societies have collapsed is that we have tended to think that justice, that democracy is not, that it's reached some kind of endpoint and you no longer have to struggle for it. Just consume, go to the market. I mean, they've sort of been convinced that freedom is now about everything that neoliberalism says it is. Shut up and buy. After 9/11, Bush gets up and says, go to Disneyland, right? Hello? I mean, it actually borders on something that almost seems psychopathic in its implications. But I think that increasingly, people also realize that freedom is something that has to be struggled over. No society is ever just enough. And when we can convince people that you can never sit back and say, for instance, oh, there aren't any classes. We're all middle class. You cannot stop buying this nonsense. Or when we see the suffering in Gaza, make it clear that the United States is as responsible for this as was Netanyahu. They're being bombed. Kids are being bombed with our military, right? I mean, the question we have to begin to raise that has never been raised strongly enough is, what kind of future do we want for our children? What kind of society do we want to live in? I mean, do we want to turn it over to Elon Musk and this group of psychopathic morons who basically care about nothing more than accumulating more wealth than is even imaginable? Or to live in a society with an utter collapse of conscience. I'm writing this new book, and it's all about conscience. I mean, how do we talk about conscience? What happened to that term? Yeah. How do we talk about memory? This book is called The Assassins of Memory, right? I mean, I was reading today that in Emmett Till, when Emmett Till was killed in Mississippi, are you ready for this? There was at least one lynching every day in the South, 1 to 2 lynchings every day in the South. This is the 1950s, right? In Mississippi alone, over 500 Black people were lynched. Now, do we want to erase that? Do we want to say that makes white people uncomfortable? I mean, is there not something to be learned here about what we don't want to become, given the legacy of racism and slavery? So it seems to me that this question of consciousness, this question of historical memory, this question of being able to think comprehensively and put things together, this business of thinking outside of fragments, this business of not just thinking in economic terms, but in thinking of terms of justice and what it means to, this is the challenge we face today. And this is an eminently politically educational issue. If we can't change consciousness, if we can't get people to identify the languages, like this is the great thing about LA Progressive that you mentioned earlier, Sharon, and that is we need to produce a language in which people can recognize themselves, not some abstract language that five people read. And this is not an argument against theory. I've often been accused of being too theoretical. Oh, I can't read him. He's obscure and all this stuff. But I think we need to talk to people in ways in which they can understand what we're saying. And that doesn't mean that we eliminate rigor. It means that we combine rigor and comprehension. That's what we do. I mean, I've noticed with respect to this argument, this talk about schools, recently in the Chronicle of Education, there were two pieces by two academics. And they were disgusting, actually, both of them, in which they're claiming that schools are not political. And that the academics should have nothing to do with being political. And that's one of the reasons that Harris lost. You know, you're woke, blah, 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 all this stuff. Schools are eminently political. There is no aspect of education that is not political. And not only is it political, it's a site of struggle over what kind of knowledge do you want to suppress? What kind of knowledge do you want to include? What kind of values do you want to reproduce? What do you want to teach kids about history? What do you want to teach kids about future? And what do you want to teach them about their own sense of agency? Are you telling me that's not political? When you have one state in Texas that can define what books should be bought for a curriculum for the entire country, how do you separate power relationships from the question of what education is in any country? I mean, these are absurd arguments, but what scares me is that in the face of this Trump, Vance, oligarchic crew, people now surrender to power. Mm-hmm. Right. And they normalize it, and they become accomplices to it. And we're not just talking about everyday people. We're talking about intellectuals who know better.
Yeah, so that's the part that I don't understand. I can understand the danger of this. There are many dangers, but from an educational perspective, the young people that are coming up now, that maybe are not even old enough to vote, under this administration, what's being normalized is just that the billionaires, the cronies, right, the nepotism is fine. Nepotism is fine. It doesn't really matter the quality of the work that someone provides. What matters is their relationship to you and their fealty to you. And this type of way of being and of conducting an organization is what becomes the norm for the rest of the population.
This is so important, Sharon. Look, Stanley Aronowitz, my brother, the late Stanley Aronowitz, one of the smartest people I've ever met in my life. He wrote a piece called "Where's the Outrage?" Right? And what he was trying to understand, what I've been trying to understand, and what I think we're all trying to understand in some way is 20 years ago, if a candidate had an affair, mm-hmm. and somebody caught it on camera, they were done. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We've elected a rapist, a guy who's utterly corrupt, who's a psychopathic liar, who believes in nepotism, who runs selling sneakers and cards, baseball
and
cards,
and Bibles.
It just goes on and on. The ultimate hack, right? I mean, the ultimate grifter. And the issue is not, does he do this stuff? Because he does. But the issue is, how does it become normalized? Right. What is it about the collapse of civic life and civic culture and social responsibility, but most of all, education, that allows this not to stand out as such an affront to any notion of civic sensibility, civic responsibility, and social justice, that this incredibly Hitlerian circus barker could now become the president of the United States with almost winning the popular vote. That's frightening.
So you say, I mean, the antidote to this dismal future and dismal present you're describing is a mass movement, a persistent mass movement that has some goals to really change some things. And I'm trying to imagine that arising now. I don't really see it coming out of any of our current political parties, large or small. The one that I imagine in my lifetime that that seems to fit that bill was the civil rights movement of my youth that was widespread and long lasting and achieved some goals. Now maybe those goals have washed away, but it does seem possible. And I wonder, where do we see? I mean, the Occupy Wall Street movement was pretty widespread, but it was kind of hit a narrow part of the populace. Where do you see such a mass movement arising?
I see it arising among workers in various places who are going to be suffering in 2 years in a way that's almost unimaginable. And they're not going to be suffering simply because they can't buy food anymore because of these tariffs. They're going to be suffering because all around them they're going to see images of the police and the National Guard and the military basically arresting people, beating people up, and putting them in jail. In other words, we're going to be flooded with a sense of images that are going to correspond in some way to the lie that this government in some way cares about people and are going to make America great again. They're going to make America white again in the image of white Christian nationalists. That's what they're going to really do. And they're going to do it unapologetically, and they're stupid and they're determined. And I think that, I have never been one to believe the old Marxist line that objective conditions automatically produce particular kind of political results. But I do believe that the objective conditions can get so bad that the possibility for resistance and the raising of consciousness can be accelerated to a degree unlike we've ever seen before. And I really do see that coming. And I must tell you, I think the vanguard of that movement, meaning the early stages of it, might not even come from, let's say, the dock workers, or might not come from those major organizations, that unions that have a national and international reach. Even the Teamsters, they'll be suffering for what they've done. It's going to come from young people. I think that young people all over the country who have the freedom to mobilize in ways to raise consciousness and educate people. I mean, will anybody ever think about Gaza in the same way that they have in the past, given what young people have done in the last year? I mean, does anybody now, is there anybody who doesn't know what Gaza is? So I think it's coming. I think maybe I'm terribly wrong, and I'm not talking about political guarantees, but I think I'm aware of one thing. The repression is going to get worse. Yeah. The inequality is going to get torturous and punishing. And I think in light of that, there is an opening for a kind of pedagogical reawakening. The mobilization, as Angela Davis has talked about the need for a mass consciousness to begin to talk about a number of things. One, the red line. This is a very important concept. Where is the red line being crossed from democracy to fascism? That right. Needs to be, that we need to say, we have to set a line. We just can't say, oh God, look what's happening. Say, the line has been crossed, right? We've got to push back and embarrass the legacy press, where they have to now begin to recognize that they have contributed to this fascist politics that we now inhabit. And that in some way they had better rethink, because increasingly the online platforms are going to take over. They're going to just simply take over. They're going to simply take over a whole generation of young people who are not going to believe this bullshit anymore. It doesn't work, and then maybe the unions can begin to be mobilized in ways that we haven't seen. But I do think that this is not an argument, by the way, for being despairing. It's an argument for saying, let's get organized. Let's think, what are the strategies we need to focus on? What does it mean to talk about the red line? What does it mean to stop talking about consumerism and start talking about terrorism? We live in an era in which domestic terrorism has become state policy. Mm-hmm. They're right. The enemy is within. They're right, and it's them.
Right.
Well, once again, Henry, you've dropped a ton of wisdom on the LA progressive community. We always look forward to talking to you. I welcome you to come back as often as possible, because these are some great conversations and very stimulating.
Yeah, it's delightful talking to you, Henry, and we're so glad that your health is good and you look happy.
I love the LA progressive. You're kidding. I think this is a model for what has to happen all over the United States, if not internationally. I mean, this is the model. Talking to people in ways they understand, talking about enormously important issues, publishing people who basically are not part of the legacy press. I can't even look at this stuff anymore. I mean, it's just, I can't even look at it. You know, I turn on Netflix. You know, I mean, it's just so, it's like a bad horror movie, you know. So my point is simple. I'm just very grateful that you have me on and you invite me, and I hope many other academics, intellectuals, writers, people who are concerned, you know, swell the ranks and participate in this kind of politics.
Yes, and
Thank you, sir.
and for those who don't write, what you can do is share. So we're asking people to please subscribe, share. LA Progressive is now a member of Blue Sky. So we're moving away from Twitter and into Blue Sky, and we ask you to share on Blue Sky, the fastest growing social media that has nothing to do with Elon Musk.
You know, I think the other thing is every article that gets published on your piece should have a headline on top. It should be please share, put on as many platforms as possible. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it should be the red line, the alert.
Yeah.
Right.
Because that not only makes visible the fact that you're providing information that matters, it makes visible the fact that it's information that should matter to everyone.
Sure.
Right.
That's right.
Well, we'll look into that. So,
Okay, great.
Can't wait till the next time we get you on the screen and get to read your articles. Thank you so much.
I can't wait either. Thank you so much.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for sticking around. If you like the LA Progressive content and the discussions we have here, please consider clicking the subscribe button below and also give us a thumbs up. That helps to grow our audience by feeding the algorithm, which helps to get this content in front of more eyes. Thanks for stopping by. We really appreciate your support.